Hello, this is James Beebe, instructor for Philosophy 333, Epistemology at the University at Buffalo. In this video lecture and slide presentation, I'm going to talk about fallibilism and infallibilism in relationship to skeptical challenges to our knowledge. So I'll be talking about G.E. Moore's fallibilist response to skepticism, Fred Dretske's fallibilist response to skepticism, and I'll say just a few things about infallibilism and some things about the nature of the most common kinds of skeptical challenges. At the end, I will ask you to make up your mind as to which perspective you think sounds most plausible. In my previous video lecture presentation on fallibilism, I ended the presentation by noting that there were several challenging questions that philosophers have raised for fallibilism, and one of the biggest, if not the biggest, concerns skepticism. As I noted in that presentation, skepticism is most commonly discussed in the form of skepticism about the external world, where skepticism is the view that you don't know anything about the external world. It grants that you may very well and probably do have knowledge about the contents of your own mind. But these questions, there are important questions that arise for fallibilism because fallibilist justification, by definition, is not maximally strong. The kind of strength or evidence that fallibilism talks about is less than conclusive. Fallibilism, as Stephen Hetherington defines it, is the view that, we basically never have super maximally strong evidence or reasons for anything we believe. And the fallibilist goes on to say, and that's okay, we can still know stuff. The human situation is one where our evidence and reasons are only so strong. They can be pretty strong, but nevertheless, there's a limit, and that limit falls below the maximal amount. But this means that fallibilism doesn't conclusively rule out skepticism. So, according to fallibilism, the following couple of statements are true. If you have two hands, you can say the following: I know that I have two hands, but I might be wrong. If you really have two hands and you have the ordinary kind of evidence that we normally have, then you are going to be in a position to have very strong evidence that you've got hands. But according to fallibilism, the evidence that you have will be less than maximal in its strength, therefore leaving open the possibility that you might be mistaken. And so this statement is something that it is correct for you to say from a fallibilist perspective. I know that I have two hands, but I might be wrong. But critics of fallibilism, as I sort of briefly noted at the end of the fallibilist presentation, critics of fallibilism say this sounds not quite right to say. I know that I have two hands, but there's a 5% chance or so that I don't have two hands. I mean, if there's a good chance, if there's a chance that you're wrong, you don't know. That's what the critic would like to say. The fallibilist would like to dig in their heels at this point and say, no, even though there's a chance that I might be wrong, I can still have knowledge in this epistemologically imperfect situation that we live in. So here's just a slide just putting down what I've said before about skepticism. The only kind of skepticism we'll talk about, not the only kind of skepticism worth talking about. I'm writing a book on a completely different kind of skepticism, but for our purposes, this is the overwhelmingly most commonly discussed kind of skepticism, so it'll work for us. Now, the most common way that challenges from skeptical perspectives involves skeptical hypotheses. So see that these are thought experiments, little tales that involve situations which we in our ordinary lives do not take to be actual. Things like Descartes' evil genius or evil demon, which comes up in his Meditations on First Philosophy. Descartes says, let's imagine a being that's as supremely powerful as God, but not nice like God is supposed to be. And this being arranges our lives such that basically every belief we have about the external world is false, because this is a malicious being, and it just gets its kicks out of thinking there's a desk that my laptop is on, but there's no desk. It just gets kicks out of, sending me desk-like appearances, where these appearances are not reliable guides to any reality behind the appearances. There's no desk there. There's no laptop. There's no spoon. There's no nothing. So I think we can all relate to usually science fiction-based kinds of movies that incorporate something like this kind of thought experiment. So Descartes, of course, doesn't believe there's any such being that's messing with us like this, but he uses it as a dialectical or philosophical tool to sort of make some points about the nature of certainty, about the nature of human knowledge, and he wants us to reflect on whether we have reasons that are sufficiently strong that can show we are not in fact being deceived by an evil demon. Descartes asks, is it possible for us to have that kind of reason? He thinks that it is possible. The skeptic doesn't think it's possible. So in 1981, Descartes' evil demon scenario was given a sort of modern science fiction update in a widely discussed book by Harvard philosopher Hilary Putnam. On this hypothesis, thought experiment, you are just a brain in a vat. You're a brain floating in a vat of nutrients hooked up by electrodes to a supercomputer that's feeding you all sorts of stimulations through your cerebral cortex, making you think that you have arms and legs and a belly button and a laptop and a desk, when in fact you have no arms, legs, or belly button because you're just a disembodied brain in a vat of nutrients. You don't have a laptop or a car or friends or a job. Those are all just hallucinations fed to you by a pattern of electrical activity coming into your brain from the supercomputer. And Putnam just wants to ask similar kinds of questions that Descartes does, but just with a sort of new, a new, more modern twist. Doesn't involve a supernatural kind of being, but a sort of science fiction scenario. And it's Hilary Putnam's brain in a vat scenario that was part of the inspiration behind the movie The Matrix, which I think was released in about 1996, which I always forget to put on the syllabus to require students to watch The Matrix, but I really need to do that. So in The Matrix, Keanu Reeves plays a character called Neo, as most of you will know, but not as many as you not as many students know The Matrix as they used to, 20 years ago when it was more current. And they think they live in a world that looks like this. They think they wear lots of cool-looking tight leather or PVC pants and overcoats and sunglasses that in the late 90s apparently were thought of as cool. But in fact, no. These people all live in some crap little hole in the ground, rusty old place. They wear rags. They live in kind of semi-filth. Yeah, no tight leather, nothing. Now in this scenario, their bodies basically look the same. Notice their faces all look the same as in the previous one. But nevertheless, there's a whole lot of their reality that's not like it seems. So in epistemology, in both the East and the West, scenarios like this have been used to raise questions about our knowledge. I possibly should have put a slide in here from Zhuangzi, an ancient Chinese founder of Taoism, who asked a similar sort of question. How do I know I'm not just a butterfly who's dreaming that he's a human being? A very vivid, very compelling dream. How do I know that that's not my actual reality? It's not clear that Zhuangzi was actually a real person, but let's don't worry about that too much right now. I think he might have lived in about the 4th century BC, but I'd have to look that up to make sure. But in any case, around the world scenarios like this have been used across the centuries to raise questions about our knowledge. So skepticism is the view that you don't have knowledge of the external world. For all you know, you could be just nothing more than a brain in a vat, or an entire body in a vat, as the Matrix would have it. In the Matrix, you're not just a disembodied brain, your whole body, but you are hooked up to some supercomputer system that feeds you stimulations through your nervous system, making you think your reality is one way, where it's not, actual reality is not at all like that. It's just a big grand illusion. Skepticism says that for all your piddly little fallible reasons show, you could easily be in the Matrix, you could be in a brain that your fallible little reasons don't rule out these possibilities. So there's a depiction of Hilary Putnam's brain in a vat as drawn, I think it was drawn by David Chalmers, the most prominent philosopher of mind in the last quarter century. Certainly appears in an essay from Chalmers we're going to read later. The key thing about each of these skeptical scenarios is the content of your belief is incompatible with the content of the skeptical scenario. You think you're walking outside in the sun in Tucson. That's the content of your belief. I'm walking with legs outside with sun in Tucson. David Chalmers was teaching at the University of Arizona at the time. But the content of the skeptical hypothesis is that you are a disembodied brain. So you're not walking because you don't have legs for walking. You're not outside. You're inside a lab somewhere, and it's probably not in Arizona. So the challenge for fallibilism is to show how they can make sense of statements like this. Fallibilists always want to be non-skeptics. They basically, you don't have to go that route, but that's the normal route. Fallibilists want to say, we know we have hands, we know when we're walking outside, we know when we're walking inside, and we can know that we're not brains in vats. We can know we're not in the Matrix. We can know we're not being deceived by a Cartesian evil demon. We have basically all the knowledge we ordinarily think we have, mostly. Fallibilists in the history of philosophy generally want to preserve our common sense conception of how much knowledge we actually have about the world. The challenge for them is to show how the statement here in quotation marks can be true. We can know that skepticism is false even though our evidence isn't strong enough to rule out the possibility that skepticism is true. Even to fallibilists, there's something that sort of doesn't sit with them quite right about that statement. It usually doesn't feel totally cool. I mean, as soon as you start saying our evidence doesn't rule out that possibility, it kind of sounds like you're saying you don't know that that possibility fails to obtain. So you don't know it's false. But according to, so in any case, the two different parts of this statement in quotation marks, there's tension there. And the fallibilist is usually taken to have some work to do in explaining how to maybe try to get rid of that tension. So one way that fallibilists have responded has been articulated by a guy named G.E. Moore, a philosopher at Cambridge University in England in the early 20th century, known to be one of the founders of what used to be called analytic philosophy. G.E. Moore is very much, in epistemology, a defender of common sense. And, of course, we have a reading from G.E. Moore on the syllabus. And in this reading, G.E. Moore says, sure, we can show skepticism is false. And G.E. Moore's way of showing skepticism is false is widely criticized. I don't think everyone really appreciates his true starting point, though. His true starting point is, let's just think about the way that we show anything in philosophy or out of philosophy to be true or false. What do? All the time, every time we want to show anything. Well, we look around for some very plausible premises. Premises that are not just slightly more probable than their negations, but like a whole lot more probable. Like that, you know, basically everyone everywhere can just see to be true. Like no one's going to disagree with them. And then, in an ideal scenario, we show that our conclusion follows from these premises. This is what we do anytime we try to construct an argument that shows something to be true or shows something to be false. We try to find the most plausible we can in the ideal situation. They're very plausible. Everybody sitting around the table is going to nod their head and say, yes, of course. And then ideally we have one that's got a very simple and transparent deductive structure so that everyone can see that the conclusion clearly and obviously follows from the premises. So in that kind of ideal situation, you should have succeeded in showing that your conclusion is true. And of course you put in the conclusion the thing that you're trying to prove. These are platitudes. G.E. Moore's right. It's obvious that that's what we do anytime in philosophy or out, where we try to show anything to be true. We don't always succeed in putting forward premises that everyone else around the table, everyone else in the room thinks is plausible, and then maybe we run into some obstacles. But if we could construct an argument where everybody is going to be forced by their powers of reason to nod their head in agreement with our premises, then, you know, we're in pretty good shape as far as proving the conclusion we want to prove. And that's what Moore is going to do with his infamous proof that skepticism is false. So imagine that you're not just reading G.E. Moore, but you're seeing him in person in Cambridge lecture about this. And imagine him gesturing with his hands as he puts forward the argument. He raises up one hand and infamously says, here's one hand, gestures in the air with the other hand and says, and here's another. And the next part of the argument, these are premises to his argument, where the conclusion is going to be the falsity of skepticism, the known falsity of skepticism. Premise 2, as it's written in G.E. Moore's article, is basically kind of already baked into premise 1. It's kind of implicit in premise 1, but I put it here separately and explicitly. You know, as he's waving his hands in the air and saying, here's one and here's another, he's saying, look, folks, come on. You and I both know these are hands. Not just hand appearances, but like real hands. These are plausible premises. And then the next premise seems very plausible as well. If you and I both know that these are real hands, then we have knowledge of something in the external world. Hands are made out of flesh and blood and located in space-time. 3 seems uncontroversial. But if we have knowledge of the external world, then skepticism is false, because skepticism, by definition, is just the view that we don't have knowledge of the external world. So, therefore, we can conclude that skepticism is false, that we know it's false. I mean, if we know these are real hands, we're in a position to know that skepticism is false. So what Moore does is follow that pattern outlined on the previous slide, find some premises that are super duper uber plausible, that anyone with any sense, half a brain, is going to agree are true. And that's why he chooses his hands, particularly in a setting where he's lecturing in front of someone face to face, where he can wave the hands in front of them and they can see right in front of their face, here's a hand, here's another. Anybody with any sense is going to agree, yeah, that's a hand. A real hand. And a real hand is an object in the external physical world, made out of matter, located in space-time. And anybody with any sense is going to agree that it's far more plausible that we know these are hands, that these really are hands, than they are going to agree that no, they're not actually hands. They're just, consider the negation of premise one. Instead of these really are hands, the negation would be no, they're not. Possibly because they're just appearances. They're things that appear to be hands, or that appearance is brought to us by some deceptive being, or set of beings, like in the Matrix. But which of those is really more plausible? I mean, come on, Moore says. What's more plausible? Obviously, clearly, it's more plausible that these really are hands, and I mean, you and I know that they are. Okay, so Moore is kind of ridiculed often for thinking he can prove something deep and philosophical and profound just by waving his hands around in the air. And there's a sense in which it does seem kind of simple-minded, but I don't think people who make fun of him realize that he started with a starting point that says, let's just think about how we show anything to be true anywhere, in a court of law, in a scientific debate, anywhere. We look for plausible premises that any sensible, rational person is going to assent to, and then we provide an argument, as the one here on the screen, that has a very transparent deductive structure where it's clear, it's obvious that 5 follows from these premises in a valid, deductively valid manner. Now, ask yourself how compelling you find Moore's infamous argument to be. Reflect on it. I'm going to move on to some other positions, including that of the skeptic. The way that the skeptic's position is most commonly presented is as agreeing with Moore on these two statements that appeared as premises 3 and 4 in Moore's argument. In the slides that follow, I'm going to note the points of agreement and the points of disagreement between various interlocutors in this debate. So the skeptic and Moore are both going to agree, if you and I both know these are hands, then we have knowledge of the external world, and if we have knowledge of the external world, then skepticism is false. And of course, the reason the skeptic can agree to these, the reason they can agree to these things is because they are hypothetical. They begin with an if, you know. Of course, the skeptic doesn't think that the part after the if is actually true, but they can still assent to the conditional statement in 3 and the conditional statement in 4. But the skeptic combines with 3 and 4 the following things, the following perspective. Sure, if we have knowledge of the external world, then skepticism is false, but we don't know that skepticism is false. If you and I both know these are hands, then we have knowledge of the external world, but you and I don't know that these are hands. The skeptic basically likes to argue that you can't brush aside a scenario like Descartes' evil demon scenario, the brain in a vat scenario, the matrix scenario. You can't show that those scenarios are non-actual simply by waving in the air what appear to be actual hands. That's not, I mean, the skeptic will grant, sure, they appear to be actual hands, but the skeptic is not going to grant that they actually are hands, real hands, spatiotemporal hands, your hands, and not just hand hallucinations fed to you through a supercomputer by electrodes. What Moore and the skeptic are doing is can be understood by comparing modus ponens and modus tollens, and this is an important thing to know, not just in this current debate, but you'll see a pattern like this in other philosophical debates in other classes you will take. One person's modus ponens is another person's modus tollens, it's sometimes said. Ideally, you would have taken Intro to Deductive Logic before this course. And modus ponens and modus tollens are just Latin terms for two very common argument patterns. Modus ponens being the most common argument pattern there is. It involves a conditional premise. If statement P is true, then statement Q is true. And statement P is true, so therefore Q is true. So that's modus ponens. It just means the modus, the mode, the way. Ponens meaning something like direct, the direct way of reasoning with conditionals. If P then Q, P therefore Q. And modus tollens begins with this same conditional premise. If P is true, then Q is true. But it goes by way of the back door, the indirect way. If P is true, then Q is true, but Q isn't true. Therefore P isn't true. So both the skeptic and Moore agree on the conditional parts of Moore's argument, but disagree on the other parts. But I wanted to sort of simplify and symbolize in modus ponens and modus tollens form the argument here to note something about an additional point of agreement between Moore and the skeptic. So notice there with modus ponens we have both P and Q coming out true. P is said to be true there in a premise. Q is said to be true there in the conclusion. But notice in modus tollens we have both P and Q coming out to be false. The falsity of Q is asserted as a premise, and the falsity of P is drawn as a conclusion. The idea here is that P, in both the modus ponens and the modus tollens versions, P and Q stand or fall together. And Moore and the skeptic are going to agree that there's a certain kind of different kinds of knowledge that stand or fall together. And the kinds of knowledge that stand or fall together are going to be these things. Knowing that you have hands and knowing that skepticism is false. So the skeptic thinks that you don't know you have hands and you don't know that skepticism is false. You don't know you're not a brain in a vat. You don't know you're not in the matrix. Moore, the fallibilist non-skeptic, thinks that you do know you have hands and you are in a position to know that skepticism is false. But I wanted to use the modus tollens and modus ponens diagram and this particular table to show the points of agreement. Because as we'll see in just a moment, Fred Dretske is going to reject the idea that these two kinds of knowledge, represented in the two columns to the right, stand or fall together. He doesn't think they stand or fall together. You can have one without the other. So reflect on Moore and his argument against skepticism and his attempt to begin from plausible premises that show that a very important philosophical conclusion obviously follows from those premises. This guy named Fred Dretske, an American philosopher and very nice man, who, as I noted a moment ago, wants to reject an idea that's common to both Moore and the skeptic. So Dretske's idea, Dretske represented here as a third row, is that you can know that you have hands and yet not be in a position to know that skeptical hypotheses are false. So Moore and the skeptic both agree if you can't know that skepticism is false, you can't show it to be false, then you don't have any knowledge of even the most basic, ordinary, humdrum thing whatsoever. So Dretske's view is, look, there are very difficult philosophical conundrums, puzzles, paradoxes in the history of Eastern, Western, Indian, whatever philosophy that people have tried to solve for centuries, for millennia, and they've not always succeeded in doing so. I believe there's significant skepticism in the philosophy of the ancient founder of Taoism in China, Zhuangzi. There's significant skepticism in Plato. There's significant skepticism in the Pyrrhonian skeptics, as represented by the writings of Sextus Empiricus. In the ancient Western world, skepticism has been around for ages. And all these philosophers, Dretske says, think that you, in order to just walk down the street, not in philosophy class, not in epistemology class, just in life, you're going down the street to get a cup of coffee. These philosophers are so enamored with their philosophy and the importance of these intellectual puzzles they devote their lives to. They think they are so important that if you can't solve their super duper uber important philosophical puzzles, then even in your ordinary life, as you're walking down the street to go get a cup of coffee, you don't know that it's coffee in your hand. You don't know that the coffee shop is at the end of the block. You don't know that you're on a sidewalk. You don't know anything if you can't solve the great epistemological puzzles of all of human history. And as you can tell by the way that I've told Dretske's story, you can tell what his perspective is. His perspective is, come on, you don't need to be able to solve these big giant puzzles. I mean, you can just, it's possible to know you've got a cup of coffee in your hand, and yet at the same time have no idea how you would show skepticism to be false. Those two things are perfectly compatible. Remember the row in the table a moment ago, the final row, Dretske's row is, yes, you can know you have hands. Even if no, you have no idea how you would show or know these abstract, weirdo, skeptical scenarios to be false. So Moore is commonly taken to be a defender of common sense, but Dretske thinks he's a defender of common sense as well, but in a different way. He wants to reject the idea that knowledge that you have hands and knowledge of the falsity of skepticism stand or fall together. You either have both kinds of knowledge, like Moore says, you know you have hands and you know skepticism is false, or you have neither. The skeptic says, you don't know you have hands and you don't know skepticism is false. Dretske wants to cut the rope that binds those two things together. I like that Dretske's position raises these sort of big questions about the relevance of philosophy to ordinary life. Most philosophers throughout all of history tend to think that there isn't this big distinction between the abstruse philosophical theorizing they do in their study and in ordinary life. They think if you can't solve the puzzle in ordinary life, if you can't solve their philosophical puzzle in an academic environment, then there are big repercussions for what's true in your ordinary life and how you should approach your ordinary life. And Dretske, David Hume has some famous remarks in his book on human nature. Where he tries to separate the academic work that he does from the games of backgammon that he plays. And Dretske's kind of like that, but Dretske wants to make for even stronger separation than Hume suggested. So ask yourself, do we need to be able to solve those philosophical problems to have basic ordinary knowledge in ordinary life? So I think there's something compelling about Fred Dretske's kind of humility about the pretensions of philosophy. Nevertheless, he faces some very important and challenging questions, like the following. According to Fred Dretske, you ought to be able to say the following thing and it sound perfectly fine. I know I have hands, but I don't know I'm not a handless brain in a vat. Remember, brains in a vat are disembodied brains floating in vats of nutrients. Say that all together in one breath. I know I have hands, but I don't know I'm not a handless brain floating in a vat of nutrients. Does that statement as a whole, asserted all together in one breath at once, sound right to you? And critics of Dretske say no, it shouldn't, it doesn't. I know I have hands, but I don't know I'm not a handless brain. I mean, one of his critics named Keith DeRose has called this an abominable conjunction. And in another set of articles, DeRose calls this an ear-bruising conjunction. Sounds wrong, Keith DeRose says, to say that all at once. Okay, ask yourself, does it sound wrong to say it all at once? And, and ask yourself as well about Dretske's earlier position about whether you really need to be able to be in an epistemological position that's strong enough to know the answer to an age-old philosophical problem in order to just have basic knowledge about your hands and feet and toes and coffee. So I want to say now a little bit about infallibilism. So, infallibilist about knowledge, and Descartes is an infallibilist about scientia at any rate, think that it's possible for us to have maximally strong reasons that conclusively show skepticism to be false. You can know that you're, with absolute certainty, that you're not a brain in a vat, Descartes thought. A lot of people don't think we have reasons that are that strong. What I wanted to note right here is that the skeptic is commonly interpreted as being an infallibilist as well. So I wanted to note that the Cartesian perspective and the skeptic perspective are commonly presented as agreeing on some things. Now they disagree on the statement that's on the current slide. Descartes thinks it is possible to have maximally strong reasons that conclusively show skepticism to be false. And the skeptic doesn't think it's possible to have that kind of reason, and therefore, of course, doesn't think we can know skepticism to be false. But Descartes and the skeptic are both infallibilists of a certain sort. So they both agree on the following. In order to know that skepticism is false, in order to really know anything, you need maximally strong reasons. So I wanted to note this point of similarity. And ask yourself whether fallibilism or infallibilism sounds right or wrong, but note that infallibilism comes in both a skeptical form and a non-skeptical form. Right? So Descartes is the non-skeptical form of infallibilist, and this skeptic is, of course, the skeptical form. But both of them are infallibles because they agree to that statement right there in the center of the slide. In order to know that skepticism is false, and indeed to know anything, you need maximally strong reasons. Is that the right view to take? If infallibilism is the right view to take, then you have to ask yourself, okay, do I adopt the skeptical form or the non-skeptical form? Of course, fallibilism is going to reject this thing that Descartes and the skeptic both agree on. So Moore is a certain kind of fallibilist. He doesn't think that we can know with certainty, or that we need to know with certainty, that he has two hands. But he does think that we can know that we have two hands. And once we see that, and we see that it deductively follows that if we know we have two hands, then we can know we're not a handless brain in the vat, well then we're in a position to know that skepticism is false. But to note another point of agreement between two of the parties to our discussion, Moore and the skeptic both agree on the following. If you can't know skepticism is false, then you can't have even the most basic or ordinary kind of knowledge. Now, Moore and the skeptic disagree about some other stuff. Moore is a fallibilist. The skeptic is an infallibilist, as commonly portrayed here. I'm just going to play along with that for, pedagogical purposes. So Moore and the skeptic disagree about the fallibilism-infallibilism issue, but they agree about the following. If you can't know that skepticism is false, you can't have even the most basic kind of knowledge, and Dretske rejects this idea. So as you construct your own theory of knowledge for your big paper that you're going to turn in here in just a little bit, ask yourself which of the various points of agreement and disagreement that these various views take on board are views that you want to take on board into your own theory that you find to be most plausible. So every view sort of has a cost and a benefit. The cost of infallibilism is taken to be that, well, if it's true, we don't have much knowledge. The cost of skepticism is that, well, our epistemological state is a whole lot worse than we ordinarily think it is. The cost of fallibilism is they wind up saying things that sound, when we put on our philosophical hat at least, sound not quite right. When we talk like a fallibilist in ordinary life away from the philosophy classroom, maybe they sound okay, but when we put on our philosophical thinking cap, there's things that don't sound quite right. So there's kind of like a cost, or at least an alleged cost, let's put it that way, to each of the various views here. And, ask yourself which one is the best of the lot, the lesser of the various evils. So that's my presentation on fallibilism, infallibilism, skepticism.